You used to be faster with money decisions. You know that, even if you haven't said it out loud. There was a time before the books, before the podcasts, before the spreadsheets and the Reddit threads and the YouTube rabbit holes, when you just made choices. Maybe not perfect ones, but you made them. You moved. Now you know more than you have ever known. You understand compound interest, expense ratios, dollar cost averaging, tax loss harvesting, sequence of returns risk. You have read about behavioral finance. You have listened to experts contradict each other with equal confidence. And somehow, you are more stuck than you have ever been. Not because you don't understand what to do, but because you understand too many versions of what could go wrong. Not paralyzed in an obvious way, you still function. You still pay bills and manage accounts and tell yourself you're being thoughtful, being careful, being responsible. But somewhere underneath that, you know, the decisions aren't getting made. The money sits, the months pass. And the more you learn, the heavier it gets.
Let's be honest about who you are, because this conversation only makes sense if we start there. You are not someone who ignores their finances. You haven't buried your head in the sand. You've done the opposite. You've leaned in. You've educated yourself. You didn't just learn the basics. You went far enough to start seeing contradictions. You have taken this seriously in a way that most people around you never have and probably never will. You track things. You think about the future. When something goes wrong financially, you don't just accept it, you go looking for why, and you try to understand it well enough that it doesn't happen again. That is not a flaw. That is a form of conscientiousness that most financial advice doesn't even account for, because most financial advice is written for people who aren't paying attention at all. It's written for the person who doesn't know what an index fund is. That's not you. That hasn't been you for a long time. And the thing is, everyone told you that more knowledge would help. Every book, every course, every podcast promised that once you understood how money really worked, the decisions would get clearer, easier, more confident. So you kept learning, and you expected that clarity to arrive. It didn't, or at least it didn't in the way you were promised. And you've probably wondered, quietly, maybe uncomfortably, whether something is wrong with you, whether other people find this easier, whether you're just not cut out for this kind of decision-making. You're not broken, and this isn't unique to you. What's happening to you has a shape, it has a logic, and once you see it clearly, it becomes very hard to unsee.
Here's what no one tells you when they hand you a book about money. Knowledge doesn't simplify financial decisions. For a certain kind of mind, a careful, pattern-seeking, risk-aware mind, knowledge multiplies the weight of every decision. Not because the decision is actually harder, but because you can now see more of what could go wrong. That's the trap, and it is a particularly quiet one because it disguises itself as wisdom. When you didn't know much about investing, you couldn't fully imagine the downside scenarios. You didn't know about sequence of returns risk, the reality that retiring into a down market can permanently damage a portfolio in ways that a later recovery can't fully fix. You didn't know about the historical variance in asset class performance. You didn't know how many variables are genuinely outside anyone's control. Ignorance, in a strange way, protected you from the full weight of uncertainty. But now you know. And knowing doesn't feel like power. It feels like standing at the edge of a very large, very complicated decision and being able to see in vivid detail every way it could go sideways. So you research more. You add more data points. You look for the piece of information that will finally tip the balance, the one insight that will make the right choice obvious. And the research turns up more variables, more edge cases, more expert disagreement, more reason to wait a little longer, think a little harder, be just a little more certain before you move. This is not laziness. This is not avoidance in any simple sense. This is what happens when a disciplined, analytical mind encounters a domain with genuine complexity and genuine stakes, and is told repeatedly that more information is always the answer. Intelligence doesn't protect you from this pattern. In a very specific way, it makes it worse.
The mechanism at work here is not complicated to describe, even though living inside it feels enormously complicated. It starts with knowledge, real knowledge, not superficial, not misunderstood. You genuinely understand the concepts. And with that understanding comes something that most financial educators never adequately warn you about: a dramatically expanded awareness of risk. Before you understood investing, risk was an abstract word. Something could go wrong, sure. After you understand it, risk becomes specific. It has names and historical precedents and percentage probabilities. You know about inflation eroding purchasing power across 2 decades. You know about the hidden costs embedded in actively managed funds. You know that timing the market is a fool's game and that staying entirely out of the market is its own kind of timing. And here is where the mechanism takes hold. The human brain is not wired to process expanded risk awareness with equanimity. There is a deeply embedded psychological tendency, one of the most thoroughly documented in behavioral science, to feel the pain of potential loss far more intensely than the pleasure of equivalent gain. This is not a weakness specific to anxious people. It is a feature of how human judgment evolved. Loss hurts more than gain feels good. This is true across cultures, across education levels, across income brackets. Now take that tendency and combine it with genuine, detailed knowledge of everything that could go wrong. What you get is a mind that can generate almost automatically a comprehensive case against any financial decision. Not because the decision is wrong, but because the mind is doing exactly what it was trained by evolution and by years of financial education to do. It is identifying danger. It is cataloging risk. It is trying to protect you. And the emotion that follows is not quite fear, not quite anxiety. It's more like a weighted heaviness, a sense that the stakes are too high to move without being certain. And certainty in financial decisions is almost never available. Markets don't guarantee certainty. Tax law changes. Interest rates shift. Life intervenes in ways that no spreadsheet anticipated. So the emotion says, wait, be sure first. And then the behavior follows naturally. You wait, you research more, you consume more content, you add more perspectives to weigh. And the next time you approach the decision, your expanded knowledge provides even more variables to account for. The heaviness returns, and the cycle continues. The loop is self-reinforcing. Knowledge feeds risk awareness. Risk awareness activates loss aversion. Loss aversion creates emotional weight. Emotional weight delays the decision. The delay creates the need for more current information to justify the decision. More information creates more knowledge, and around it goes. You didn't become more informed, you became harder to move. What makes this particularly difficult is that every step in the loop feels responsible. Doing more research feels like due diligence. Waiting feels like prudence. Weighing more perspectives feels like intellectual honesty. None of these things feel like avoidance. They feel like preparation. And that is exactly why this pattern can run for years, for decades, without ever announcing itself.
This channel exists to examine the psychological structures behind financial decisions, the patterns that educated, capable people fall into, not despite their intelligence, but sometimes because of it. If that kind of examination is useful to you, you may want to stay close to this channel. This pattern doesn't live in the abstract. It shows up in the ordinary texture of daily financial life, and when you see the specific shapes it takes, something tends to click. Consider the person, and maybe this is you, who has had money sitting in a savings account earning almost nothing for 18 months. Not because they forgot about it, not because they're careless, but because every time they sit down to move it, the question of where to move it opens into a dozen sub-questions. Should it go into a brokerage account or a Roth IRA? If a Roth IRA, which funds? If index funds, which index? Domestic exposure or international? What allocation between them? And if they've already maxed contributions for the year, does that change the calculus? And what about the tax implications of the timing? These are real questions. They're not imaginary complications invented by an anxious mind, but they are questions that 6 months ago produced the same result. Nothing moved. And 6 months before that, the same. The money sits. The decision waits for clarity that keeps not arriving. Or consider the person who has been meaning to meet with a financial planner for 2 years, not because they can't afford it, but because they've read enough to know that not all financial planners are equivalent. Some are fiduciaries, some aren't, some work on commission, some charge flat fees, some charge a percentage of assets under management. They've read about how to interview a financial planner and what questions to ask and what red flags to watch for. And somehow, having the knowledge of how to do it correctly has made starting it feel more complicated than it used to. There is also a quieter version of this that lives in smaller decisions. The person who knows enough about credit card rewards to understand they're leaving value on the table with their current card, but also knows enough about the psychology of spending to worry that optimizing for rewards might subtly shift their spending behavior. So they stay with the card they have, not out of laziness, out of a kind of hyper-aware stalemate. Each of these scenarios has the same underlying shape: a person with genuine knowledge, genuine intention, genuine capability, held in place by the very sophistication that was supposed to set them free.
What's the decision you've understood for months and still haven't made?
How long ago was that?
This is where the shape of the pattern becomes harder to look at directly, because the cost of this kind of paralysis doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a bill. It doesn't show up as a failure you can point to. It accumulates in the quiet space between what you did and what you meant to do. The 18 months of savings earning almost nothing, that's a cost. Not devastating in isolation, but the pattern that produced those 18 months is the same pattern that produced the 12 months before them and will produce the months that follow. It's not one decision delayed. It's a way of relating to financial decisions that compounds quietly across time. And here is what makes this particularly difficult to fully absorb. The cost is always invisible until it isn't. There's no moment where someone hands you a statement showing what your portfolio would look like if you'd started investing the way you intended to 4 years ago. You don't see the insurance you didn't buy until something happens. You don't feel the retirement security you didn't build until you're close enough to retirement to start doing the math, and the math doesn't work the way you needed it to. The thing that tends to crystallize first isn't the money itself, it's the feeling. It's arriving at 52 years old and realizing that you've been thoughtful about money for 2 decades, that you've read and listened and learned more than almost anyone you know, and somehow the financial picture doesn't quite come together the way it was supposed to. That feeling doesn't have a clean explanation you can share at a dinner party. It's not that you made bad decisions.
In some ways, you barely made decisions at all, and that's harder to explain and harder to sit with than a clear mistake would have been. There's also the quiet erosion of confidence over time. Because every year the pattern continues, the gap between where you are and where you thought you would be grows slightly wider. And that gap becomes its own psychological weight, another reason that financial decisions feel heavy, another reason the stakes feel high, another reason to make sure you are absolutely certain before you move. The pattern, left unexamined, doesn't fade, it deepens. The longer you wait for certainty, the more the waiting becomes the default. And defaults are stubborn things. They absorb years before you notice what they've cost. None of this is destiny, but it is the direction this particular pattern moves in, quietly, if it stays invisible.
Take a moment with these. Not to answer them out loud, just to notice what comes up. Is there a financial decision you have genuinely understood for more than a year that you have not made? When you imagine finally making that decision, does the relief you'd feel arrive with an immediate, "But what about?" Do you consume financial content regularly, but find that more content tends to introduce more uncertainty rather than less? When someone less financially literate than you makes a confident money decision, even a reasonable one, do you feel something between admiration and mild frustration? Have you ever caught yourself thinking that if you just read one more thing, you'll finally feel ready? These are not judgments, they're mirrors. What you see in them is information about a pattern, one that has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with what happens when a particular kind of mind encounters a particular kind of uncertainty. Sit with whatever came up. Here's the reframe that tends to shift something, even slightly, when people really encounter it. The paralysis you have been experiencing is not the sign that the decisions are too hard for you. It is the sign that you have been approaching financial decisions with a standard of certainty that financial decisions, by their nature, cannot meet. Certainty is not available in markets. It is not available in interest rate forecasting or tax policy planning or retirement projections or insurance decisions. The information keeps updating. The variables keep shifting. The experts keep disagreeing. Waiting for certainty in this domain is structurally identical to waiting for something that will never arrive. And the mind that keeps researching, keeps gathering, keeps waiting, that mind isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was trained to do. It's trying to reach certainty through information. It's applying a strategy that works brilliantly in many domains of life, domains where enough research actually does produce correct answers, to a domain where the correct answer is permanently probabilistic. This is worth sitting with, because it changes the frame entirely. The goal was never to make the perfect decision. The financial decisions you've been delaying don't have a perfect version waiting to be discovered. They have a reasonable version, one that could have been made months or years ago with the knowledge you already had, and a paralyzed version that accumulates cost while continuing to wait. At some point, the decision stops being between good and bad options. It becomes a decision between acting with uncertainty or staying stuck with it. Seeing the pattern clearly doesn't make the decisions easier, not right away, but it does change what you are looking at.
Instead of scanning for more information to resolve the decision, you can begin to recognize the moment the information search is no longer producing clarity, the moment it's producing volume. That moment has a feeling, a familiar one if you're honest with yourself. You know what it feels like when the research has stopped helping and started substituting. Most people in this pattern have known that feeling for a while. They just haven't had a name for it. They've called it diligence. They've called it prudence. Naming it, observing it without judgment, that isn't a solution, but it is the beginning of a different relationship with the pattern. And for a certain kind of mind, that shift in awareness tends to matter more than any piece of financial advice ever has.
You started learning about money because you wanted to do right by yourself and the people who depend on you. That motivation was never the problem. The problem was a mismatch between the kind of certainty your mind requires before it acts and the kind of certainty that financial decisions can actually offer. The problem was never a lack of knowledge. It was the expectation that knowledge would remove uncertainty. That mismatch is very common among people who think carefully, and it runs quietly for years beneath the surface of perfectly ordinary, competent-looking financial lives. You can see it now. Maybe you've sensed it for a while. Now it has a shape. If something in this video described a moment you recognized, a pattern you've seen in your own decisions, it might be worth leaving a note about it below. Not to explain yourself, just to name it. That's the beginning of something.